Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. What's it like to lead one of the world's best-known charities? Today, we're going to find out as I'm speaking to Halima Begum, CEO of Oxfam. Halima is new to the role, having previously led ActionAid UK. Her career has taken her through some fascinating roles and organisations, including DFID, the British Council, the Lego Foundation and the Runnymede Trust. Quite a scoop of an interview for us here at A Little Bit Radical, so let's get into it. Halima, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rob. And I'm so glad to be invited to one of the world's leading podcasts, A Little Bit Radical.
So kind of you to say. Your check's in the post. Thank you, Halima. So, Halima, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
My early memories of radical is narrated to me by my parents, actually, because obviously I was quite young. But when I first came to this country, I had an eye disease, and this eye disease had got so severe that unless I received treatment from the hospitals, I would be blind in both eyes. So my father and mother, both migrants in the East End, took me to one of the public hospitals for treatment, and they were denied access to treatment for me.
Goodness me.
And that went on for days. The doctors just wouldn't treat me, I guess based on some notion that they thought that I was a child from a foreign part of the world. I was about 2 years old, actually. So my mother had brought me to the UK after a very long traumatic journey from rural Bangladesh via Moscow to get to the UK. And when we arrived, just tired, exhausted, thinking that we would get treatment because my father was a British citizen, just to be told that I wouldn't get treatment was quite traumatizing and upsetting and distressing. And what my father and mother did in that moment of desperation is take me out of the hospital, and they went to their local mosque in Brick Lane. And they literally left me in a bundle in the doorsteps of this mosque, which back in the days in the East End used to be a synagogue, and by now it had been transformed into a mosque. And they left me in the doorstep for the local imam to take responsibility for me. And the words that he spoke was, "I can't help my daughter anymore. I'm now leaving her with you." And at the time, I thought that it was an act of desperation. Perhaps it was, but actually it was an act of campaigning. It was an act of taking direct action and then wanting his community to support me get access. And it was genius, really, because the imam had no choice but to galvanize the local community, the local Bangladeshi community, to run a campaign that would then allow the hospital to treat me. And it's because of the community-led campaign, which my father and mother instigated out of desperation, but it was an act of genius as well, I was able to get treatment at an NHS hospital. And I'm very grateful, Rob, because I lost sight in one eye, but I still have sight in the other one. And I'm so forever grateful to the community, my father, my parents, my family, to mobilize on my behalf. And that really was the early form of activism and a bit of radicalism, if you like, because it literally mattered. If my father hadn't taken that action, I would be blind, and I just think I would have had a different future. I have some sight of my remaining eye, but like, my God, I just think back to those days, and my father narrated that story in such a way as though it wasn't something to celebrate or something to be aware of. So yeah, that was my early influence and the early start in my life.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Halima. I mean, my goodness, I can't imagine. I am a parent of a 3-year-old, so about the same age that you were when all that was happening. And I can't imagine being refused treatment for your little baby and feeling that incredible sense of injustice and hopelessness. But then the sort of tenacity and the sort of activist spirit to seek help and ask for help. And I can see how that experience will be imprinted on you and your family. I think it's no surprise that you've ended up a lifelong activist and campaigner. And I understand that there was something else in your childhood when I was researching this interview, which is that your first home was a squat, which you then later were able to live in again. Is that right? Tell us about that.
When my father and mother arrived in the UK, they were squatting actually because the local authority didn't easily provide housing to Bangladeshis. These were very different times, Rob. These were very racist times. I still think there's a racism in British society these days, but these were very different times. And so we were living in housing that was already earmarked for demolition. So very insecure, dangerous housing. So my parents were desperately trying to get access to public housing and being refused. And of course, having children in such a desperate situation, people like my father squatted in any empty buildings that nobody else wanted. And once they squatted, in other words, broke in, but it was legal at the time to break in. So
Yes, there were different legislation at the time, wasn't there, around squatting? Yeah.
Yeah. So if the building was empty, you could legally squat in. But once they broke in, they paid rent straight away. So you had to go get a rent book and pay. So we squatted in our first home, which was in the corner of Brick Lane, which is near Shoreditch in London, if your listeners know the geography of London well these days. And that's where I grew up for my formative years. And then I subsequently left the country through work to be posted in different parts of the world. And when I came back after spending years and years and years overseas for work, I then came back to live in that same home. And, some of it was nostalgia, the memories. Some of that memory helps and continues to help me understand, I suppose, the struggles that many families still continue. And it keeps me very grounded in my work, in my life. And yes, I'm enjoying living there at the moment because, as I said, the geography of London these days is very different.
Completely transformed, right? So you're now living in one of the most gentrified areas of the country, arguably, right?
That's right. And I think a lot of the developers are trying to kind of redevelop public housing. So the public housing that I grew up in. And there's a very strong campaign going on at the moment to retain part of that community fabric. So yeah, it's very different, but they are trying to get rid of people like me. But yeah, I think we are organizing. So that campaigning streak, ironically, that fight for public housing many decades ago continues to remain, really. But the campaign isn't against the racists these days. It's actually against big corporate developers.
Capitalism, in a way.
Mega capitalism.
Mega capitalism, yeah.
Mega capitalism. And the Bangladeshi squatter movement that's recognized as a protest movement that helped forge the British Bangladeshi identity in the East End of London. So the fight for public housing and the fight to stay in Brick Lane today is kind of linked to the identity of the British Bangladeshi community. That's why that fight is a collective one and remains so today.
What a beautiful thread to draw between you and your life, the way it's gone, and your career, and then your home and where you grew up in. I mean, I'm sure to listeners, it sounds like a childhood full of strife, but is that how you remember it, or did it feel something different to you when you were actually living it?
I think as a child, we very rarely understand strife. Probably we can't understand strife as much. But for me, I guess the biggest trauma was actually the loss of my brother. So I lost a sibling, quite violent circumstances, for a knife crime, in fact. That was probably the biggest trauma. So everything else paled into comparison. But in other ways, growing up, aside from that singular event, which was transformational in other ways, I don't remember the strife as much. What I do remember is, growing up in a neighborhood where there were hardly any shops, Rob. And I say this with some irony, yes, because you can't really move in Brick Lane these days without bumping into designer shops and
cereal cafes and that kind of thing.
Cereal cafes that basically make sourdough and avocados look affordable. So I don't really have a problem with sourdough bread and avocado. I actually quite like it. But these days, Brick Lane and Shoreditch is not affordable for even the gentrifiers, I would add. But the strife, I do recall, the strife in some ways was very emotionally scarring because the National Front, which is the precursor to the English Defence League, which is the far-right national racist organisation in the UK, the National Front had a bookshop outside the door where we lived, and they used to sling petrol bombs and God knows what else, pork through the letterbox. So it was incredibly violent, symbolically, physically. So that strife was quite hard. As I say, these were different times, but one never forgets those memories. It was a book stand, not a bookshop, sorry, I should say. That was really difficult. And that's one of the reasons why in the summer of 2020, when Black Lives Matter imploded in the way that it did, and racial justice and injustices was so front and center in our national mind, I took a decision to join the Runnymede Trust because I wanted to join an anti-racist charity to pour everything that I had into that fight back. It was really important for me in 2020 to come back and join the Runnymede Trust and help with that fight back on anti-racism.
Well, great shout out to a fantastic charity which you led for a couple of years, but is obviously still going strong. And I didn't know that actually, that it was societal events that had led you to join them. First of all, I mean, thank you for sharing all of that, Halima. I'm so sorry to hear about your brother and that he had to suffer that and that you as a family had to suffer that. And I suppose what's occurring to me in everything you're saying, actually, you keep saying it was different times, but, you know, we are still facing the horrible effects of knife crime in the UK. We're speaking in the aftermath of the summer riots, which were very racially motivated. Someone like you who's experienced it firsthand can never forget that stuff. But I think that collectively, maybe we're not forgotten, but maybe we're not quite remembering it accurately and seeing where that can lead. I don't know what you think about that.
You're absolutely right. And of course, the racism problems are still persistent today. But what I think we're also struggling with is that public space, the social media space. It's so crowded with misinformation, toxicity. So to keep a focus on the persistent problems of racism is much harder now as well. The summer violence from the far right, I'm very careful not to refer to them as race riots because that takes two. It was actually the far right mobilizing and instigating violence on British high streets. That was all fueled by obviously decades of narratives that would stigmatize migrants and people of color, but also very high profile individuals who would lend their support to racists and violent thugs. I mean, that has been quite harrowing. And I think we need urgent action to stamp out that sort of online toxicity. So that's what's different, Rob. We didn't have online toxicity. And actually, disadvantaged communities from all community backgrounds are being stoked and used as fodder by the far right in ways and on a scale I've never seen before.
This feels like a good moment to come on to your work now and the changing role of charities and campaigning organizations in the world, I think, dealing with issues like that. You've recently taken over as CEO of Oxfam. This might seem a little bit basic, but could you tell us about Oxfam, potted history of Oxfam? It's obviously one of the most well-known charities in the world, but I think probably a lot of people don't know much about, how it was founded and overall what it looks like today. So could you tell us that?
Yeah, so Oxfam was founded in 1942, would you believe, and in Oxford, hence the name Ox.
That's where the ox comes from, okay, yeah.
That's where, and we are now a very large Ox family compared to the size that we are in 1942, but it was set up as the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, and it was in a direct response to the Allied blockade that had caused the famine in Axis-occupied Greece. We took action and raised vital funds to support the famine relief efforts at the time, but we also spoke out against the injustices of ordinary people paying the price of decisions made by a select few. And in 1945, the famine committees, and there were so many famine committees around the UK, we were urging the UK government to let the Brits send food parcels to Germany, even Germany, and to lift the blockade. So we've always challenged the very divisive, harmful decision made by the world's most powerful people. And we've always spoken out against unfairness and injustice. And to this day, we are advocating for a fairer and more equal world. I wanted to talk a little bit about the speaking out piece because we've never really just operated as famine relief or humanitarian response because we want to see a fairer world. And if we only worked on the humanitarian crisis without thinking about the broader injustices that we live with as communities across the world, then it becomes a kind of superficial response that's not longer term. So Oxfam's DNA has always been linked to relief response, but also speaking out against injustice.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that potted history of Oxfam. I learned something. I didn't know that at all, actually. So thank you very much. I'm going to come back to the specific work, but I did want to ask you about speaking out, actually, because you as a person, as a leader, as a sort of prominent person in the activist space, you're often asked to speak out or represent or, be the mouthpiece of a certain situation, conflict, group of people. And I just wondered, how do you approach that? How do you approach when you're asked to come onto Question Time or something and talk about conflict in the Middle East, a mammoth topic? How do you think about that in your mind? And do you feel that a kind of weight of, responsibility?
Sometimes it can be frightening, incredibly pressurizing. And so just to give you an example, a year ago, I was asked to come on to Question Time to talk about the Gaza violence. And this was 3 days after October the 7th. I was busy with a number of things, and they called on the day and said, could I come and be part of the show by 6 o'clock? And that was to take part with Piers Morgan as well on the panel. And that was after the hostages had been taken. So in a split second, I had to make that decision. And I did wonder whether it was a straight no. Because remember, we hadn't had a national discussion or debate yet on hostages, the bombardment of Gaza. None of that had happened. And Question Time on any day is quite high stakes for anybody. And it was obvious to anyone who had an inkling of the history of that particular part of the world that this was going to be a minefield. And for me, as a Muslim woman too, it was going to be a minefield. But I felt, Rob, a sense of responsibility. That sense of responsibility and duty to actually take part in that conversation in order to represent so many voices that don't get airtime weighed quite hard on me. So although I was actually a little bit frightened of the minefield, a bit vulnerable, I felt like there was a sense of responsibility and duty to go onto that show.
To quote a very popular self-help book, it was kind of feel the fear and do it anyway for you at that point, would you say?
In my case, I often block out the fear. So at times of extreme stress, and I felt this same sensation actually doing earthquake responses in Nepal, for instance. If I sense that there is some fear mounting inside my body, I have to block it out, and I do block it out quite well. I decompress afterwards, of course, but you have to just block it out, and you have to get into that space, and you have to hold your own. And it was really interesting because in the green room, we were backstage, and there were a few personalities, including Piers Morgan, who I mentioned. And Piers, as you know, is never really shy of an argument. And I sort of went into the green space, and I was incredibly friendly. One might even say quite charming to all my other guests behind the scenes. And at some point, Piers said to me, for a group of people that are about to go out on national television and rip each other apart, you seem remarkably calm. So I said, oh, Piers, well, actually, I'm used to negotiating with the Chinese Communist Party in China. You're only a journalist. You write with a pen. And we laughed,
Brilliant.
So that was my way of really disarming, my guests. It wasn't going to be an argument with the guests. It needed to be a conversation around the humanitarian piece. Piers was really nice to me. Really, really nice to me. So I think, we established a bit of a rapport behind the scenes about how we were going to relate to each other. And given the seriousness of the discussion that I had come to talk about, I could not be distracted. So often, it's a split-second decision that has to be made, but with the full awareness of long-term implications of what it means to speak out. And you have to calculate all of that in your mind. You can't go and speak to a team or lawyers or people. You've got to be able to think on your feet and make that decision really quickly. And it's only your decision in the end. Anyway, Rob, there were other times where it's been really lonely. So during the publication of the Commission on Ethnic and Racial Disparities report, which was published a few years ago in Britain, which was a report on the state of racism in the UK, commissioned after Black Lives Matter. During that publication, Liz Truss, in her role as Equalities Minister, so this was before she was Prime Minister of Britain, said some incredibly nasty things to me personally and to my organisation from the dispatch box. So it was a highly public space, which then led to several more MPs in her party to attack me personally, and to then navigate that space, to hold the integrity of the organisation, the racial justice space, and my own integrity as an individual was really, really hard. And we didn't have access to resources in the same way that larger organizations like Bernardo's did at the time. And that took just almost everything that I had, Rob, to try and keep that integrity. And that was quite hard. I mean, sometimes I look back and it is quite disturbing to work through, and all the different ways in which smaller organizations and leaders from lived experience and racial justice movements are attacked. It's much easier to attack smaller organizations and individual leaders from grassroots spaces than it is to obviously hurt leaders from larger organizations. So that was a really difficult time. But somebody asked me, would you have done what you did again, knowing that this was the way in which you would be hurt? And if the answer is yes, then you would do it again. And the answer is always yes, because you always stand up and fight for what is right. And I don't regret a moment.
Were there times where you did think about kind of throwing in the towel, quitting, taking a break during that period?
My family told me to take a break. My friends told me to take a break. And after 3 years of being in that role, and it was at the height of the culture wars in Britain, while obviously a lot was happening in America as well, my family told me to take a break. And I listened. Because when your mum tells you to take a break, and my mum doesn't work in the professional space, she doesn't understand about the complexity of the culture wars. But what she does understand is how her children, her adult children, are feeling and what stress levels they're carrying. And I think when your mum tells you to take a break, it was time to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you lean on in those times of stress? How important is the non-work stuff to deal with that work stress?
Incredibly important, Rob. Not just to deal with the stress of work, but to understand the importance of the joy of life. So for every fight that I speak out on, for every incident of injustice, that fight comes from the joy of life, that comes through love. So knowing what there is to love in my world, my family, my life is quite important to me, because that's what also drives me to speak out. So I like to spend time with family, actually the youngsters in the family, and do sort of quite trivial things with them, like visit city farms, play with the rabbits, take them out, let them make fools of you, because it's something really empowering about young children when they can play with adults and really find their own voice through trickery and jokes and all of that. So probably green space, city farms, spending time with family and friends. And more recently, I've actively shrunk my personal space to make sure that when I am switching off, work doesn't find ways to creep into that space again. Because one of the joys of actually being at Runnymede or Oxfam or the work that I do, that everybody wants to have a conversation always about the injustices of the world, because they want to have an intellectual spar with other people that care. So, if I'm not careful, I'd be intellectually sparring 24 hours around the clock. So you have to be quite mindful about when it is that you stop. And for people not to feel that you don't care, you do care, but you have to be quite purposeful about creating space that is about decompression and joy. And so I've actively started doing that. Recently, strangely, it was quite difficult over the summer to take a break because of the far-right riots. So I didn't end up taking the break. But then my husband basically booked us a holiday somewhere, let's say in a part of the world where the water was blue. And every time some kind of stress or trauma entered my zone, I just went snorkeling. So it was a choice of fish or trauma. It was an easy choice to make. So sometimes you have to take it down to the basics, just switch off. And I've got used to doing that now.
I think you said something so profound in that, Halima, which is that your energy for your work and your activism comes from being able to appreciate the joy of life. And I think that is a real lesson for everyone, everyone who experiences work stress, who's trying to get something done, who's trying to make a change, particularly those who are involved in kind of activism or campaigning. Because I don't know a community that gets more burnt out and stressed than activists, frankly, because you're dealing with all that stuff that you've talked about, So I think that's great.
I agree. Sometimes there's guilt there, Rob, because of course in the background there's the Middle East violence that's raging and it doesn't stop. And parts of Gaza are being wiped off the planet as we speak. How you switch off from that is very difficult, very difficult. So there's a lot of guilt there, even when you decompress.
I can understand that entirely. And I suppose the question we have to ask ourselves is, what purpose is this guilt solving? To use a very therapist type question. And it does serve an important purpose, I'm sure, because it keeps us focused. But in excess, it can't be helpful, I'm sure.
No. So like when I pick up a book to try and switch off, my thoughts go straight to my colleagues in Gaza. My thoughts go straight to incredibly distressing images in the social media. I'll give you an example. When the murder of George Floyd was filmed and shown across the media, I didn't watch that video, Rob. Similarly, I have not been watching the videos of death and destruction of children in Gaza. And so it's very hard. So you wear the guilt, you take the guilt to bed, you wake up with that guilt. So understanding how to process that guilt is something that I'm still working on. It's not guilt that informs my work, not at all. It's actually, as I was saying, it's love for humanity. It's that, because guilt by itself can be quite harmful. And I'm trying to find ways in which to motivate the work from the place of joy and love of humanity. Because in these moments of protracted violence and attempts to wipe out humanity, it's very, very important to find that love and to demonstrate to others that love exists. Because if you were experiencing the violence in different parts of the world today, in Sudan, in Gaza, it's very difficult to see the love or the hope.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the hope word there, and the only thing that truly can serve as a long-term solution is hope. If you can't have the hope, then no one can keep going, right?
Right. And the hope needs to be linked to some structure of intervention as well. So in some ways, you can get into a cycle of anguish because you're thinking of Gaza, and then suddenly you remember that no one's thinking of all the other forgotten conflicts that we're working on at Oxfam, like in Sudan, for example. But with hope, you need structure, because when it's so violent, hope is not enough. You need the structure. What do I mean by structure? Structures of organizations like Oxfam, like the UN relief efforts that can provide the means to get aid and also the means to get a space where diplomacy and mediation can bring about a ceasefire. So hope by itself is not enough when the violence is so protracted. And this is why organizations like Oxfam, Save the Children, whole range of small, large organizations that exist to give some infrastructure with which our hopes can be realized in some of the world's most forgotten crises and the not so forgotten crises. So it becomes really important to underscore the hope with action, is what I mean. Action and infrastructure.
Thank you for sharing all of that in its complexity, Halima. And I'd like to take us back to leading one of these structures that you talk about, leading Oxfam. And so it occurs to me that, we've talked about the kind of the guilt and the responsibility, and you're leading an organization of thousands of those people who presumably feel exactly the same. But talk to us about what it's like leading an organization like that. Because I understand that for all this kind of spokeswoman role that you do and being on Question Time, you decided to spend your first day at Oxfam actually volunteering in one of the shops with some volunteers. Is that right?
Yeah. When they asked me, how do you want to spend your first day? And the usual thing happens, like there's a diary of inductions of people to meet. But I'd go back to, how I felt when I heard I got the job, Rob. And I remember when they offered me the role, it took a while to sink in. And my immediate thought was actually guilt, because I was going to be leaving my current colleagues because I was at Action Aid then. And I felt guilty, but then it slowly sunk in. And so my family and I went for a walk to our local high street where there was an Oxfam shop. And we just stood outside of it with a smile on our face. Oxfam meant so much to us as kids, right? We didn't go to Oxfam when we were kids because it was fashionable to buy secondhand clothes there. It is fashionable to buy secondhand thrift clothes now, of course, but it wasn't then. But we went to Oxfam because it was one of the few places where you could afford clothes. And if we didn't go to the Sunday market on Brick Lane, we would go to the Oxfam shops. So that's why it was so important. So my family and I went for a walk to the high street and stood outside the shop, and we smiled. It was, I just smiled. And you didn't need to speak the words of joy. Sometimes you don't speak. Like, it's not always important to speak. And we just stood outside the shop and we smiled. And I guess the emotions that went through me was around, did I really get the job? And I don't mean this in the sense that I don't really buy into this theory of imposter syndrome. I really don't. And I particularly think for women who would question it themselves so much, I think that doubt is so misplaced. I think that we should be thinking about organizations that need to be thinking harder about the fact that they create barriers rather than us as individuals thinking that we lack something and we have imposter syndrome. So I don't have that. But nevertheless, I grew up as a squatter family. So for someone like me to be in this role, working class woman from a migrant background, and I'm disabled as well. So it's quite a big deal, I suppose, hence not finding the words either. And I'm Muslim as well. Honestly, I just had to take a moment and think, did that really happen? And obviously, back in the 1980s, we used to have the old boys networks. And these days, I'd say that there are other forms of influence and networks. And there are certain sorts of people that get certain sorts of jobs. I just didn't see myself as the person that would be leading Oxfam. So it's with immense pride that I do this job now, with an immense sense of responsibility and duty on behalf of the Oxfam networks. But most importantly, Rob, in the same way that the racial justice movement is a movement, so it's not an organization you lead, you actually lead a movement of people who are volunteers, activists, and colleagues. And it's that immense sense of Oxfam's history and legacy that I find myself playing a small role. The thing I'm most proud of, because I talked about the many barriers that I faced, I'm probably the most proud of the fact that I overcame the class barrier.
Oh, interesting. So, out of being disabled, a migrant, a Muslim woman, you think the class barrier was the biggest barrier?
Because it still remains the invisible barrier in Britain. Now, obviously, being Muslim or disabled, there are layers to that. But fundamentally, I'm proudest because I overcame the class barrier, not by, I have to add, becoming more middle class. No, none of that. Just staying true to my background and being able to be my authentic self. Because I think it's really important as we take up these spaces that we actually feel more confidence in ourselves rather than try and emulate the notion of what is the right role model that doesn't feel right to us. So I'm really proud of that, Rob.
And so you should be. You reminded me of the book, The Class Ceiling, and Daniel Lorison and Sam Friedman fantastic book. And I'm so glad you've raised this. Let me try and get this right, the thing from that book that really stuck with me. So if you had a working class person and a middle class person going to the same university, studying the same degree, and the working class person gets a first and the middle class person gets a 2-2, in 10 years, the middle class person has done better in their career. It's earning more than the working class person who was a better student and technically better. And that is because of this invisible barrier, and the various, they go into detail around just the unwritten rules, being able to fit into these communities of people, and this concept of polish that exists in the professional world, which, middle class people have more exposure to, when they're growing up. I'm so glad you've raised that, Halima, because I think it's not talked about enough. So thank you for that.
Did you say middle class polish?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
I'll try and remember that. Because when I think of the word polish, I think of nail polish, obviously.
Yes.
I don't wear much of, but the concept of nail polish is something that you wear in order to groom and present yourself in a kind of an additional way to what your authentic self is, right? But for me, the middle class polish would not be authentic. But I still eat my fish and chips with my fingers from the bag. Like, that's what I do. I grew up.
That's just the only way to eat them, Halima. That's it.
I know, but I wouldn't know any other way. And that, I think, Rob, is so important because we spend so much of our lives being made to feel like we don't belong. And everything that's valuable about our own traditions is devalued. Last week, I went to the London School of Economics for an event with Oxfam, and I went through and I hit the alumni desk. And then they said, "Are you lost?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm just a bit dazed, actually, because I was last here when I was a student." And then they said, "Oh, would you like an alumni card?" And I said, "Oh, yeah. Why? What does it get me?" I said, "Well, you could have free access to our beautiful library. And if you're in central London, you could have access to our rooms." I thought, right, I'm getting one. So they printed out my original photo of when I was a student. And I stood at that moment, Rob, because I remember myself as a 19-year-old who'd come up Fleet Street on the number 26 bus from Brick Lane to come to the London School of Economics. There's a lot of rich people at that university. So I didn't know the concept of richness then, obviously, because as I said, I think we can look back at our career and see things that we may not have been aware of. But I did stop at that moment and try and remember where my heritage and roots were. And it was really nice, obviously, get a card and access to the LSE again. I don't want to diminish issues like race and gender. But when I speak about class, Rob, I grew up in the East End of London. And I grew up with a profound sense of what class is in this context. But when I speak about class, it is very much in a professional context. You can imagine what an anomaly it was at the Foreign and Development Office 30 years ago. So here I was, working class and brown, and just about everybody else didn't look like me. And anybody that looked like me, they appeared in the FCDO office in Bangladesh, not in the FCDO office in Whitehall. Things have changed, of course, since then. And to be clear, anybody else that was brown or working class was probably the cleaner.
Well, that's pretty profound. I can see why it's so important to you when looking at the barriers that you face, that you focused on that one for sure. Sadly, Halima, we must move on to the last section of the podcast, a little bit radical world. I mean, my goodness, in our conversation, we've talked about the world probably more than with any other guest we've had before. But we always ask guests, what's a little bit of a radical change for the world that you would like people to get behind?
So I think a little bit of radical change, I've got to relate it to this moment in time. I do have to do that. And I know it's trite. I want peace in the Middle East. So many of us are going to sleep thinking about that trauma. I will go to sleep thinking about this violence tonight. I just want peace in the Middle East.
I don't think anyone would argue with that, Halima. And I listened to another interview that you gave where I thought you just put it very, very neatly, sensibly, but warmly, which is that we should all be on the side of humanity. And there is no other side in conflict but humanity.
That's it. I'd like to see us resurface our humanity in this moment in time. All of us have the capacity for humanity. We have it within us. I think it's been drowned at the moment by superstructures, super narratives about them and us, right? But actually, all of us have the capacity to resurface our humanity. And if we did so, we might just about hold on to the structure that is needed to bring about peace in different parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East. But I think we need to resurface our humanity. That, by the way, shouldn't be radical. It should actually be common sense. And that tells you everything about how polarizing the conflict is. We're using the word radical here, but one of the sad things about the Middle East conflict is that it sounds totally radical to get people around the table to discuss peace. That shouldn't be all basic common sense, but that tells you everything about how polarizing this conflict is at the moment. And I fear that unless we can find more of our humanity individually within us, we would lose sight of what is peace. And it's not incredibly radical to want peace. Like, how on earth did we end up in 2024 with a sense that the notion of peace is radical even?
I think that's a great little bit radical change for the world, where we set aside the polarization and can just focus on what's required to get peace. Yeah, I think that's fantastic.
I think I'd applied that to British streets as well. So thinking about the far-right riots over the summer, wanting to bring about civility to our streets is something that I would like to see more of. And definitely peace in the Middle East. And none of these notions should be radical, but they are at the moment. That is how outrageous our world is at the moment. And we've set the clock back. They feel it. We feel it, how outrageously unjust the world is. And we've set the world back. Let's reset the clock forward.
And there's a theme that I'm picking up on there, which is that you've never been afraid to kind of reach across those divides. And I think if you're someone who is not fearful of conflict in discussion and debate and negotiation, and it just seems like the most obvious thing in the world. Yes, you'll have to talk to people that you disagree with and you'll have to reach across the divide, but that will serve a much greater good.
Yes. So interestingly, at therapy seat, somebody asked me a few years ago, how comfortable are you with conflict? And that really depends on how much conflict that you've had to deal with in life, maybe in your childhood. And I've had to deal with a lot of conflict and violence in my formative years, Rob. And as a result, I would say that I'm not comfortable with conflict. I mean, whoever is. But I can cope with conflict in a way that's needed in order to reach out to people that might not agree with me. So the idea of sharing space with somebody who I disagree with to an extreme level, I still can share that space with them because I care so much about bringing about an end to injustice that I will take that space for the greater good of that particular struggle. And I'm fearless with that. As I said, my parents taught me to be fearless in the face of extreme injustice. And I've never really lost that. And I hope that I can leave some of that behind in any way I touch the communities that I still am a part of. So dialogue is crucial, and we seem to be losing dialogue every day. But I think it's one of the saddest things about the culture wars. They're so contrived, they're so fabricated. And one of the rules of the game seems to be that you stop talking to people who don't share your views. That's damaging society, right? Because we need to keep talking. Talking is free, doesn't cost anything.
Absolutely. Well, that's how we end up with the best outcome, actually, when we talk to people with the opposing views, right? That's how we get to compromise, which is ultimately how progress is made, because you make a decision and you move forward. Yeah. Well, I think we're all the way back at your anecdote about question time with that one, Halima, being willing to share space with the people that you disagree with. And the ultimate example of that in Piers Morgan. So, yeah, although he was very nice to you, as you said. So, Halima, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. The last question we ask is always the same, which is if there's someone listening who has a little bit of a radical idea for their personal life, for their career, for a business they want to start, for a charity they want to start or get involved with, but they don't quite know where to get started. What would you say to that person?
Run with it. Run with it. There's so much society that tells you to stop, pause, reflect, feel like an imposter. Just run with it. Run with it. Tolerate a bit of failure. Run with it. The people in business have tolerated successive failures. Entrepreneurs in general tend to have access to capital and money, so they could tolerate higher levels of failure and risk. Working class young people, generally, because they haven't had access to money, they can't tolerate the same levels of failure. But it's those people that need to be told, just run with it, right? And take that risk. And you will land somewhere, not necessarily where you think you want to be, but actually probably in a different place and a better place and in a more evolved space eventually.
Fantastic, Halima. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much, and speak to you next time.